I'm Arthur Kent. Welcome to History Undercover. The Bay of Pigs. Today it's a luxurious resort reserved for foreign tourists, but it was briefly ground zero in the Cold War and nearly set off a nuclear confrontation. Our program reveals new details about the disastrous invasion at the Bay of Pigs. You'll hear from leading men in the Kennedy administration whose obsession with Castro turned a small island into a major threat. Newly declassified documents indicate much of the common knowledge about the Bay of Pigs is way off target, just like the invasion itself. Join us as History Undercover presents Bay of Pigs, Declassified. The truth about the Bay of Pigs invasion was shrouded in secrecy until 1998. After a long legal battle, the CIA was forced to release top-secret files that have finally set the historical record straight. Those documents contain incredible revelations. CIA officials deliberately lied to President Kennedy and even their own agents. The agency realized in advance that the entire invasion was doomed to fail. And a top-secret report that would have damaged the CIA's reputation was locked away in a vault for almost 40 years. This new information helps explain the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion and how it became one of the most embarrassing incidents in President John F. Kennedy's tenure and in U.S. history.
The Bay of Pigs was a colossal disaster. It helps to understand that some of the brightest people ever to reach the pinnacles of power in the United States could commit mistake after mistake after mistake.
In April 1961, a force of 1,400 Cuban exiles landed in a place known as Bahia de Cochinas, the Bay of Pigs. Within 4 hours, Castro's Air Force sunk 2 of the invaders' supply ships and strafed their troops on the beach. After 72 grueling hours, 114 brigade members were killed and more than 1,100 were captured. What really happened on those disastrous 3 days? For almost 4 decades, the details were buried among 30,000 pages of ultra-sensitive documents on the Bay of Pigs invasion. Then, in 1996, Peter Kornblue, a senior analyst for a private research foundation called the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., pressured the CIA to release their files.
Incredibly, even though this happened in 1961, the main documents, particularly CIA documents, continued to be classified. And the most fundamental document, the CIA's own analysis of what went wrong at the Bay of Pigs, remained top secret. It took more than 2 years and the threat of a lawsuit before the CIA finally declassified the document. And that has shed extraordinary light on what happened inside the CIA.
That one document reveals much of the real story behind the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1952, Cuban leader Fulgencio Batista assumed power and established a corrupt government that catered to wealthy Americans and the mafia crime syndicate. By 1957, a small underground resistance movement that was led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara grew into all-out guerrilla warfare.
In January 1959, Fidel Castro comes down from the mountains of eastern Cuba, organizes a slow, week-long march from one end of the island to another, where he is cheered like the Messiah who has just come to rescue his people.
The U.S.-backed dictatorial regime of Batista was overthrown. Frank Montiel was one of those fighting alongside Castro.
It was one of the unforgettable days of my life when we arrived to the cities. The Batista's army were surrendering. The people in the street, it was amazing.
Rafael Quintero was also part of Castro's liberation force.
The feeling of accomplishing something when you are only 18 years, something like liberating your country, was a great feeling. It was a super feeling. I never will have that feeling again.
3 months after the revolution, Castro traveled to Washington, D.C.
He had a quiet, secret meeting with Richard Nixon. Nixon reported to Eisenhower that Castro had extraordinary charisma. He is a leader of men, and we will have to deal with him.
The CIA also secretly met with Castro. According to a recently released memo, the agency wrongly assessed the new leader, calling him a spiritual leader of anti-dictatorial forces in Latin America.
The CIA believed Castro to be a Democrat, and they actually sat him down and said to him, what we want to do with you is create a secret channel to give you information on the activities of the communists in your country. And Castro said, of course, send me that secret information, I'd be happy to know it.
Although Castro denied being communist, it was only months after the revolution that he began to publicly promote nationalistic policies that were remarkably similar to those of the Soviets.
The Cuban government begins to undertake a variety of important radical measures. They begin to expropriate land to implement the land reform. They mobilize strong nationalist feelings, and by the end of 1959, that would have an anti-U.S. edge to it.
The thought of a communist enemy only 90 miles off the coast of Florida deeply concerned President Eisenhower. On March 17, 1960, the president authorized a covert plan to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. The CIA began recruiting anti-Castro exiles, mostly from Miami, to fight in a secret army called Brigade 2506. The men were sent to train at a privately owned island off the west coast of Florida called Ucepa, leased covertly by the CIA. To undermine Castro's regime, the plan called for CIA-trained partisans to infiltrate Cuba and incite a revolution. At this point, there was no thought of a military invasion.
Some of the guys, they were sent to Cuba in infiltration teams, and the rest stand by.
But the U.S.-backed infiltrators had failed to rally the Cuban people. By late fall, the agency determined that a larger force of guerrillas was needed to topple Castro's regime. And in early November, Eisenhower authorized a new CIA plan that called for a paramilitary invasion of Cuba. In January 1961, newly elected President John F. Kennedy inherited the Castro problem. Arthur Schlesinger was special assistant to President Kennedy at the time.
The day before the inaugural, when Eisenhower and Kennedy met, Eisenhower told him, in effect, you must go full speed ahead on this plan.
The plan for a small guerrilla force had given way to a full-scale invasion. Costs had exploded from $4 million to more than $40 million. A date for the landing forces was set for April 17th. On April 15th, 8 U.S. planes piloted by anti-Castro Cubans were sent to destroy Castro's Air Force. 5 bombers were completely disabled and several more were damaged. But a few of Castro's planes were left intact. At the United Nations, Ambassador Adlai Stevenson vehemently denied Cuban accusations that the United States took part in the bombing.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically.
However, Stevenson had not been told about a cover story the agency had concocted. 2 of the 8 bombers had been charged with a separate mission to bypass Cuba and land in Florida. The CIA had instructed these anti-Castro pilots and their crews to announce that they had defected from Castro's Air Force and that they alone had bombed his planes in Cuba.
Regarding the 2 aircraft which landed in Florida today, they were piloted by Cuban Air Force pilots. These pilots and certain other crew members have apparently defected from Castro's tyranny.
While Stevenson was in New York denying Cuba's allegation, reporters on the scene in Florida recognized the planes as American B-26 bombers, painted over with Cuban Air Force markings. Within hours, the U.S. role in the operation had been easily exposed. Kennedy's staff braced for the political fallout.
Kennedy could see all sorts of complications. There was no reason to believe that we could take Cuba over in a week.
The president attempted to cut his losses by canceling a second airstrike that had been already planned. That strike was supposed to provide air cover on the morning of deployment to protect the guerrillas on the beach. In the early morning hours of April 17th, the men of Brigade 2506 landed at the Bay of Pigs. This rare Cuban propaganda footage, captured by U.S. Marines during the invasion of Grenada in 1983, shows a reenactment of the 72-hour battle. More than 1,800 Cuban soldiers, civilians, and U.S.-backed guerrillas were killed. Those who were there say they felt abandoned.
Our brigade commander asked for reinforcement, asked for ammo. We never got it. We never had an answer.
Outnumbered and surrounded, the brigade was soon defeated. The men who were not captured or killed went into hiding.
We were up in the swamp for about 10 days. No food, no water. We had to drink our own urine because we didn't have no water. We walk maybe 30, 40 feet and drop to the ground because we were weak.
Finally, even those who had managed to escape initial arrest were forced to give up.
So finally the group was in me. We disassembled all our guns, drop it here and there. We set some booby traps with hand grenades, and we just surrendered.
After Montiel and the other prisoners of war were paraded from town to town, they were locked away for 20 months.
Castro's prisons, you know, is worse than hell. We had to sleep in the floor, no toilets at all. They cut the water off. It was like hell.
Then, in late December 1962, the Cuban exiles were finally released, traded into freedom for $53 million worth of medicine and food. What caused the Bay of Pigs mission to fail so completely? That answer has been hard to come by. All but a handful of copies from the CIA's own internal investigation were burned, and those that survived the fire were locked away in an agency vault until 1998. Their contents would shock the highest echelons of the CIA. The invasion at the Bay of Pigs was labeled by historians as a perfect failure, a complete fiasco, a senseless tragedy. In Washington, the finger-pointing began immediately and was aimed directly at President Kennedy.
What people doesn't realize is the cowardice of the president, Kennedy, at that time. He chickened out.
It really left a significant blemish on the brand new, shining, gleaming administration of John Kennedy. It created an impression around the world of a president who really was reckless and didn't really have a wisdom about dealing with the Soviet Union and with Latin America.
However, those in the Kennedy White House argued that the CIA was solely responsible.
Only later, after the catastrophe, did we discover, in many ways, we were misled. The White House was misled by the CIA.
Immediately after the invasion, Kennedy commissioned General Maxwell Taylor to investigate the entire Bay of Pigs operation. CIA Director Allen Dulles also ordered an investigation for the agency's eyes only. Dulles assigned his Inspector General, Lyman Kirkpatrick, to examine the agency's role in the disaster. It took 6 months, and the resulting report was shocking. Dulles was forced to resign in the fall of 1961.
The Inspector General's report was the single most scathing internal document perhaps ever written inside the CIA. It literally opened a window on the inner sanctum of covert warfare.
In fact, the internal report's conclusions were so damning that Dulles' replacement, John McCone, burned all but a few copies and hid those in a private safe inside his office.
One internal memo written by the CIA Deputy Director stated that if this report fell into unfriendly hands, and that didn't mean the KGB, that meant the press, the U.S. Congress, even other sectors of the executive branch, the report could be used as a weapon to block the future missions of the CIA.
The report clearly stated that the CIA-planned invasion may have been doomed in advance, and the sheer strength of Castro's army was one reason why.
It's important to remember that the Cuban armed forces were very powerful, they were well organized, that the Castro government had significant political support and the backing of the Soviet Union. It is very unlikely that a military operation would have defeated the Castro government in the 1961 timeframe.
Castro's army outnumbered the guerrillas by almost 200 to 1.
You had 1,200 people at the beachhead against a potential force of Castro's of 200,000. And that, the proportion was just too much to overcome.
Although the CIA knew what their guerrilla forces would be up against, the Kirkpatrick report harshly criticized the agency's solution as a serious lapse in military judgment. The CIA had assumed that the invasion force would trigger thousands of Castro's soldiers to revolt.
The CIA had made assumptions about an uprising that would take place in Cuba without any intelligence that there were forces in Cuba that would actually rise up after the brigade landed.
This was a crucial miscalculation, but some believed the agency was counting on President Kennedy to change his mind about deploying U.S. forces if the Bay of Pigs operation failed.
President Kennedy had taken a very firm line from the beginning that there would be no American participation.
Well, first I want to say that there will not be, under any conditions, be an intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces.
I think the CIA people thought that Kennedy would not hold to this line if there were any trouble, and that by sending in the Marines, he would secure their objective.
While U.S. ground troops may not have been involved, the government certainly was. The CIA, the Pentagon, and the White House had planned, armed, and authorized the action. But the operation was almost single-handedly the brainchild of this man, Richard Bissell, the CIA's Deputy Director of Plans. A Yale professor and prominent economist, Bissell died in 1994. But he was a powerful figure in the U.S. government during the Cold War era.
Richard Bissell was the key architect of the Bay of Pigs. In some of the memoranda in the White House, McGeorge Bundy referred to the 2506 Brigade as Bissell's battalion. If there was any single person that was responsible, it was Richard Bissell.
James Flannery was Bissell's assistant at the CIA throughout the Bay of Pigs invasion. This is the first time he has spoken publicly about the invasion or his boss.
Well, Bissell was a tough taskmaster, and he was in charge of all espionage, counterintelligence, covert action that was undertaken by the clandestine services. Anything that the clandestine services did, he was in charge of.
One of Bissell's earlier missions was a guerrilla operation in Guatemala in 1954.
The CIA-run operation was, in fact, a logistical nightmare. It was full of mistakes, but nonetheless, it managed to frighten the Guatemalan army sufficiently that it staged a military coup and overthrew the government.
That mission became the blueprint for the Bay of Pigs.
The Inspector General's report underlined lessons that the CIA should have learned but did not. Namely, the CIA is not good at planning these kinds of exile invasions, and we were awfully lucky. So the CIA comes out of Guatemala in 1954 with a halo of victory. And if it works so well in Guatemala, let's try it in Cuba.
Jacob Esterline was a CIA officer who helped run the operation.
I was always very impressed with how lucky we were in terms of Guatemala, that Guatemalan plan really succeeded.
In 1996, he and Colonel Jack Hawkins agreed to be interviewed by the National Security Archive for the first and only time. Hawkins, chief paramilitary officer for the Bay of Pigs, recalled when the operation was transformed into an all-out invasion.
Why, Mr. Bissell began to think on his own accord that an even larger force might be required, so that became the objective. At this point, really, the tail was beginning to wag the dog.
According to the CIA's own Inspector General, the operation should have been called off when it became clear that it would not succeed. Instead, Bissell went forward.
And because he went forward, Bissell figured prominently in the CIA's internal investigation. Had the Inspector General gone too far in singling out Bissell and his planning as the principal causes for failure at the Bay of Pigs? It was common knowledge that both men were rivals as potential successors to the Director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles.
I think Bissell got crucified in that report because Kirkpatrick wanted to eliminate him once and for all from the possibility of becoming a DCI.
But according to other declassified files, Richard Bissell had a top-secret element to his plan that only a handful of agents knew about: the murder of Fidel Castro. As the CIA moved forward with its plans to invade Cuba, there was a separate, more covert operation that few knew about: the elimination of Fidel Castro. In March 1960, the Technical Services Division of the CIA was ordered to create devices that could be used to publicly humiliate the Cuban dictator. One plan was to dust Castro's shoes with a chemical powder called thallium. The substance would be absorbed into his skin, causing his beard and hair to fall out. In two other plots, cigars were treated with a drug that could produce a temporary personality disorientation, and an aerosol spray can that was laced with a chemical similar to LSD. These schemes were never implemented. But there were other, more lethal strategies that showed just how far the agency was willing to go to overthrow Castro.
Bissell calculated that if Castro was knocked off, chaos would ensue in Cuba, and it would be far easier for the brigade to land at the Bay of Pigs.
It has only recently been revealed that Richard Bissell paid the assassins with money already earmarked for the Bay of Pigs operation.
And Bissell, unknown to most people in the administration and even in his own CIA, instigated the expenditure of money out of the budget of the invasion program to be diverted to the U.S. Mafia in order to try and kill Castro.
The head of the CIA's own invasion task force, Jacob Esterline, discovered the Mafia plot by accident.
All of a sudden, I started getting requests to authorize big payments, $60,000, $100,000, and I refused them. And J.C. King called me in and said, he said, you're going to have to sign these things. Well, I said, you'll have to tell me what I'm signing or I won't do it. He said, well, I can't, you're not cleared.
Once Esterline received his security clearance, King, the CIA's Western Hemisphere chief, told him about the assassination plan.
Well, I said, what do I say to Bissell? Oh, don't tell Bissell. Bissell's not cleared. No, don't tell Bissell about it. Hell, it was years ago I found out that Bissell was the guy behind it. He's the one that had started to push on this whole thing.
Based on top-secret CIA files, the agency prepared poison pills that were passed to mobster Johnny Roselli in mid-March 1961, just a month before the scheduled invasion. But the capsules destined for Castro's food never made it. There were other bungled attempts as well. In April, CIA-trained guerrilla Rafael Quintero was waiting in Havana for orders to kill Castro. For the first time, he spoke publicly about his role.
The first part of the operation was going to be an attempt on Castro's life, and the reason it didn't happen was they sent us a message from headquarters holding this operation: don't do it. Later on, I learned that they sent an okay from another group, and that group couldn't do it. They didn't have the resources to do it.
But the agency's failure to murder Castro was not the only setback in the Bay of Pigs plan. In Guatemala, there were 1,400 anti-Castro brigade soldiers, well-armed and well-trained, and President Kennedy was wavering.
Had he chosen to call it off, he would have had a few thousand armed men ready for fighting and extremely angry. Whether they would march on U.S. installations, whether they would attack a U.S. ally in Central America, nobody knew.
We would take over Guatemala, no question about it. No question about it. We were better trained, our weapons, our guns, they were better than the Guatemalan army, so it would be easier for us to, take over Guatemala, and then it would be an embarrassment for the Kennedy administration.
Politically, Kennedy was cornered, and it was the CIA who put him there.
President Kennedy, I think, was trapped into this. He would never have initiated it. He inherited it from the Eisenhower administration. Circumstances were such that it would have been politically disastrous were he to cancel it.
On March 11, 1961, Bissell and Dulles pressured Kennedy to go forward with the entire invasion.
CIA Director Allen Dulles went to Kennedy and said, you have what I would call a disposal problem. We really have no place else to put these men except on the beaches of Cuba.
Kennedy acquiesced, but there were other last-minute dilemmas to resolve. Principal among these was the proposed landing site of Trinidad, a highly populated town with a reputation for being anti-Castro. The CIA believed that landing the brigade there would either spark an uprising or allow the guerrillas to escape into the nearby Escambre Mountains. The president had a different take on the plan.
He felt that it was very difficult to conceal the American role in this, so he kept wanting to reduce the noise level, as he called it.
Kennedy ordered the landing site changed and gave the CIA 3 days to come up with a new location.
The change of site from Trinidad to the Bay of Pigs should have really raised a red flag. I think that Bissell should have said that we don't think that the project can be successful under these circumstances.
Instead, Bissell ordered Jack Hawkins to find another site, fast.
And what we found with all this study was there was only one place, and that was the Bay of Pigs. And I said, we can hold that area for a little while, but not very long. And moreover, the brigade has no chance whatever of breaking out of there.
It is well known that Kennedy insisted on changing the landing site, but only recently has the CIA admitted to withholding key pieces of information from the president.
Bissell did appear to mislead Kennedy by not fully apprising the president of the risks involved, particularly as Kennedy started to cut the operation back in order to maintain plausible deniability.
Bissell did inform the president that the area around the Bay of Pigs was defensible because it was surrounded by swamps. But he did not emphasize that those same swamps made it nearly impossible for locals to join up with the brigade.
And I thought to myself, well, it does look like it's secure, that nobody's going to get in there very easily. But how are we ever going to get any more recruits? How are we going to expand this force? Because there's nobody there but alligators and ducks and whatever.
We were given to understand that it would be easy to get away from the Bay of Pigs and go into the mountains and join, presumably, other anti-Castro guerrillas already established in the mountains.
That was another fact that Bissell had kept to himself. There was no way for the guerrillas to safely reach the Escambre Mountains from the new site. In his 1996 memoirs, Bissell finally confessed that there was no backup plan for the troops landing at the Bay of Pigs.
We were supposed to win. We didn't have any secondary plan to escape or to retreat or anything.
There was another reason, unknown to the CIA, why the Bay of Pigs was the last place in Cuba they should have landed.
The CIA, in its inimical wisdom, picked Castro's favorite fishing spot for the invasion. Castro knew this area like the back of his hand. He'd spent many years there vacationing, sport fishing. And in fact, because he knew it so well, he had poured the resources of the revolution into improving the lot of Cuban peasants who lived in the little towns around that bay. So he had extraordinary support for the revolution right there.
This was only discovered well after the invasion. But 9 days before the operation began, Hawkins and Esterline became worried about the feasibility of their agency's plan. Of utmost concern was a rumor that U.S. air support was going to be cut back.
And we finally came to the conclusion that this cannot work and it's going to be a disaster. And that's what we thought, and we've got to do something about it.
Early Sunday morning on April 9th, the two men went to Bissell's home in Washington, D.C. and threatened to resign.
I think he said, you can't leave me now. At this stage of the game, what will I do? And he said, as far as the air is concerned, I think I can persuade the president to allow us to conduct enough air operations to get rid of the Castro Air Force.
With Bissell's assurances, Esterline and Hawkins both agreed to continue with the task force. The mission was on, and so too was an increased need for secrecy. But the enormity of the operation made it difficult to keep the planned invasion quiet. Bay of Pigs declassified. Maintaining secrecy around the Bay of Pigs operation was crucial during the months leading up to the invasion. But rumors that the U.S. was planning a top-secret military invasion of Cuba were confirmed on January 10, 1961, when the covert mission made front-page headlines in the New York Times.
After it reached a certain point, I don't think the United States' hand could be hidden. There was an old saying in the agency, you can't cover an elephant with a handkerchief. And that's very true of this project.
That elephant may have been seen by the Soviet Union. According to documents declassified in April 2000, the Soviet Union knew the exact date of the invasion, and the CIA went ahead with the operation anyway. This new information comes from a nearly 40-year-old report of an investigative commission appointed by President Kennedy and headed by General Maxwell Taylor.
I believe that Castro knew what was going on. He had an effective intelligence service, and he probably had the brigade itself in Guatemala penetrated. So that I don't think it was anything of a surprise to him.
It wasn't. As it turned out, the newly declassified information confirms that Castro did have double agents infiltrating the brigade. Despite there being no secret about America's participation, the CIA went ahead with its bombing raid on April 15th. However, once the agency's cover story about defecting Cuban pilots was exposed in the American press, world leaders were angry. To avoid further political backlash, Kennedy canceled the remaining airstrike that was scheduled for the morning of the invasion. That order became one of the most controversial decisions of his presidency. It left some of Castro's Air Force intact and the lives of the Cuban exile force at risk.
I myself, I was promised by the CIA that the skies will be ours, that no Castro's plane will be in the air. And damn it, one of them hit our ship and blew the ship up.
That ship, the Rio Escondido, was sunk at 9:30 in the morning. It contained a 10-day supply of ammunition, gasoline, and medical equipment. A second boat, the Houston, had been hit and run aground 3 hours earlier.
I still think that the operation had a chance to succeed had the bombing raids gone on and eliminated the rest of the Castro Air Force.
However, there is disagreement whether the canceled airstrike was the principal cause of failure.
Even after the first airstrike, Castro dispersed his Air Force so that the second airstrike wouldn't have eliminated his Air Force.
A more important question for historians is whether or not Kennedy was informed of the implication of canceling the airstrike.
I don't believe anybody was explaining to him that you can't take a thin-skinned troop transport up to a hostile beach and drop anchor and start unloading troops and equipment with hostile fighters and bombers overhead. It can't be done.
Richard Bissell and Deputy Director of Central Intelligence General Charles Cabell understood that calling off the air cover would be a fatal mistake. Some believe that message was clearly conveyed to President Kennedy.
He had to understand because General Cabell was talking to him on the phone and explaining everything. And I'm sure that Bissell and his people had explained to Kennedy that air cover was essential.
But not one agent working in the Bay of Pigs war room that night knew about the critical decisions being made in the Oval Office.
We didn't know about it. Mr. Bissell had been briefing the president 2 days before about it, and we didn't know that. So we were shocked. There wasn't much we could do about it at the time, but see what happened.
It was General Cabell who informed Esterline and his men about the canceled airstrikes. When he heard the news, Esterline became enraged.
I just went ape. I just couldn't believe it. And I guess I did really go after him, and I thank God they stopped me because that would have been embarrassing, but I wanted to kill him. And of course, I never spoke to Bissell again after that.
By day 2 of the invasion, it was clear to everyone involved that the U.S.-backed forces were not winning the war.
And around midnight, I went over to the White House and found the President and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and so on, all deeply concerned about what was going on the beachhead. And there was some pressure from the Joint Chiefs of Staff that we ought to send in the Marines.
Kennedy compromised and agreed to use American pilots from the aircraft carrier Essex in a 1-hour air cover mission over the beach.
These were National Guardsmen who had been sheep-dipped, which is the lingo that the CIA uses when they take personnel from kind of innocuous division of the U.S. government and turn them into covert operatives.
But as with everything else in the Bay of Pigs operation, this plan ended in confusion and disaster. Due to a simple error over time zone differences, U.S. Air Force planes arrived 1 hour late. As a result, 2 of the bombers were shot down.
4 of these men were actually killed in Cuba. And one of the revelations of the Inspector General's report was the fact that the CIA was paying off their families through front organizations to keep their silence about what had happened to their loved ones.
That ill-fated mission is the subject of this never-before-broadcast audio tape of a private phone conversation between President Kennedy and his brother, Robert.
What happened on that? I think there were 3 planes. Yeah. And they flew air cover for an hour. Yeah. And they were supposed to give air cover to the B-26s that were coming in. Yeah. And unfortunately, between all of them, they got the hours mixed up. So the result was that the B-26s came in an hour late and were all shot down. Yeah. Or 2 of them shot down. Yeah. And I think that's probably the ones that had the emergency. Yeah.
The Bay of Pigs fiasco was a humiliating defeat for John F. Kennedy. More than once, Kennedy would ask his advisors, how could I have been so stupid as to let them proceed?
In August of 1961, one of John Kennedy's advisors, Richard Goodwin, had a secret meeting with Che Guevara. And Guevara said to him, "Thank you for the Bay of Pigs. It allowed us to assume the image of a David versus Goliath. Before the Bay of Pigs, we really had a fragmented situation. But after the Bay of Pigs, the revolution was in good standing, stronger. Thank you again."
It was a diplomatic slap in the face. But almost immediately after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy set out to topple Fidel Castro with another top-secret mission, one that has only recently been fully exposed. Only this time, the CIA was not in charge. Bay of Pigs. The failure at the Bay of Pigs and the devious role the United States had played in the invasion placed Fidel Castro and his small nation in the center of international politics. More than ever, President Kennedy was determined to undermine the communist regime just off America's southern coast.
The history of U.S.-Cuban relations really is defined by perpetual hostility. The Bay of Pigs is the fork in the road at the beginning of this long trajectory of hostile relations. It's the moment when the United States fully decided to go down the path towards all-out aggression against the Castro government, a path that we are still on.
On November 3rd, 1961, Kennedy put his brother Robert in charge of Operation Mongoose and authorized yet another group of Cuban exiles to wage a covert war against Castro's government.
Then we started working with Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was very involved in the Cuban thing.
Rafael Quintero, a veteran from the Bay of Pigs, worked for Operation Mongoose.
He sent me to Latin America first to start working, talking to people, some kind of propaganda trip.
In 1998, a newly declassified document revealed that by early 1962, U.S.-backed Cuban exiles were airdropping propaganda leaflets and destroying sugar fields. They even faked a military assault on a nearby island to convince Castro that the U.S. was planning another invasion. But before the year was up, the damage done by Mongoose infiltrators would touch off a nuclear showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union.
There's a direct bridge between the Bay of Pigs invasion, its failure, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Castro government considered itself significantly threatened and turned to the Soviet Union for support.
And that request resulted in the installation of Cuba's first nuclear missile on October 16th. 12 days later, Premier Khrushchev capitulated to Kennedy's persistent demands to remove the missiles, but not until the president promised never to invade Cuba again. Kennedy did not keep that promise for long. New evidence shows that by early 1963, another clandestine mission was authorized that few people know about to this day. Codenamed Autonomous Operations, its goal was to destabilize Castro's regime through random acts of sabotage. Once again, CIA-trained exile Rafael Quintero and his team of anti-Castro Cubans were secretly infiltrated into Cuba. But this time, there were major obstacles to overcome. In the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, support for Castro had grown.
I realized that people are not going to cooperate. Now you don't have safe houses. Now you don't have cars. Now you don't have way to move around. Now you have to fight for your food. So it's taking a real toll on you.
By mid-1964, Quintero's group had burned acres of sugarcane, blown up Army oil depots, and smuggled guns to Cuban resistance fighters. But they were unable to loosen Castro's grip on the island. Morale among the U.S.-backed guerrillas was low.
You get to the point and say, why are you doing this? What is the reason? What is the objective? And you realize that the objective is you are sending intelligence back to Washington, so somebody there in Washington is going to get a promotion with intelligence you said, and you're not going to accomplish anything here.
On November 22nd, 1963, with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, some thought these top-secret missions would be shut down. But the anti-Castro Cubans continued to bomb local companies, cut communication and power lines, and to fire on Cuban military bases well into Lyndon B. Johnson's administration.
They went on actually until mid-1964 when one of the groups accidentally sank a Spanish ship, believing it to be a Cuban ship.
But we have to respond to the Spanish government, and we have to go respond to the CIA. It was a little bit complicated.
That incident seemed to put an end to covert warfare in Cuba.
And at that point, Lyndon Johnson's administration threw up their hands and said, this is causing us more embarrassment than it's worth.
Fidel Castro had won, and the CIA-backed Cuban exiles who were hoping to go home moved on to other countries and other covert assignments.
Many of these people would go on to a variety of subsequent relations with the CIA. Some appear fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua in the 1980s, and some, of course, appeared as Watergate burglars in the pay of the Richard Nixon White House in the early 1970s. So they played a large part of U.S. history.
Many of the Bay of Pigs veterans settled in Miami, Florida, creating their own Cuba in a section of the city called Little Havana. To this day, their anger with Castro goes unabated.
Unfortunately, this all reminds me that after all these years, all the sacrifice, all the dead people, all the people in jail, we didn't accomplish anything. We're still here.
For the Cuban exiles forced to leave their homes in order to survive, there is a strong sense of sorrow. Promised by the U.S. government that they would return to a free Cuba in 1961, these veterans cannot help but feel betrayed and disillusioned with those in positions of power.
Even though I appreciate what the U.S. did for me, you can have the U.S. as a friend all the way. You can trust the U.S., whatever the name is, Armed Forces, CIA, FBI, whatever. You cannot trust the U.S.
I hope not another generation, Cubans or Americans or Russians or anyone, have to go through what we had to. I hope it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen.
In 1999, the Cuban government filed a lawsuit against the United States, asking for $181 billion in damages. The money is supposedly compensation for what Cuba called bloody acts in a dirty war that went on for nearly 4 decades. As the demand for reparations was read by newscasters on Cuban TV, the screen was filled with images of Cuban soldiers who died at the Bay of Pigs. For the History Channel, I'm Arthur Kemp. Thanks for watching.